everyone, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. Today we're talking about hedgehog cages, what you should get, what you shouldn't get, are there any real rules, and things like that. So I'll start by just telling you guys what I use. I personally use a Midwest Critter Nation cage. These are not affordable cages. They're not the most pretty cages in the world. I switched to Critter Nations because I got a cat who has a very high prey drive, and Critter Nations are incredibly cat proof. So with what I use aside, let's talk about what you need in a hedgehog cage. You need space. Hedgehogs require a minimum of 4 square feet. This is a minimum. That doesn't mean that has to be what their cage remains at. You could go bigger, you just can't go smaller. Keep in mind that this minimum is smaller than most other countries, so just remember that while making decisions about the cages you're choosing. You also have to be able to heat the cage or the space that you are giving. Hedgehogs have to remain between 72 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 22 to 27 degrees Celsius, I believe, and they need to remain at this temperature range consistently across their entire cage. This is incredibly important because hedgehogs can actually attempt to hibernate, which can be lethal for them. Your cage also needs to have proper ventilation for a hedgehog. Hedgehogs do have sensitive respiratory infections. They're not nearly as sensitive as say something like a rat, but they are quite sensitive, and it's a good idea to be aware of that before getting them any sort of cage that may not have appropriate ventilation for them. So when choosing a cage for your hedgehog, there are a lot of things to consider. One of the first things that I tell people who are new to hedgehogs to consider is heating and whether or not they have experience with it. Now, I have a fair few people that watch me that actually have reptiles and things of that nature who are familiar with heating their animals. They aren't fazed at all by the idea of keeping hedgehogs warm. In fact, some of the people that follow me and some of my friends literally do not have to heat their hedgehogs because they have reptile rooms, which are already quite warm. However, that's really not the case for everyone that follows me. A lot of people are entirely new to heating any kind of animal, particularly a mammal, and this can be kind of daunting, especially if you live somewhere that gets quite cold. I know here in the Midwest, we have fairly decent winters, not to mention up in Canada. The winters are pretty intense up there, and that's something to keep in mind if you're going to be bringing in an animal that requires a certain temperature range. I've found with people who have particularly drafty houses that they need cages with solid walls. This means something like a bin cage, vivarium, terrarium, or tank. And I'll talk more about tanks later. Essentially anything with solid walls. Reason being, the solid walls help retain heat. If you're putting a hedgehog in a wire cage in a very cold room, it doesn't matter if you're putting a heat lamp on them, because for the most part, everything that isn't directly underneath that heat lamp is going to be more similar to the room temperature than the lamp temperature. This is because all of the heat escapes out the sides. It's kind of like, imagine heating your entire house during winter and then opening all of your windows all the way. Every ounce of heat that you're pumping into the cage escapes out the sides. So if you have a house that's a moderate temperature, that's not a big deal. If you have a house that is cold, that's a problem. So for people who predict that they could possibly run into temperature issues, I almost always recommend solid cage walls. For people who don't know what kind of cage they would prefer or don't know what kind of heating they need, I almost always recommend a bin cage. In fact, bin cages are some of my favorite cages to recommend to people because they're cheap and easy to modify and easy to heat. This way, You can get used to what your hedgehog needs, give them the appropriate space, and you're not spending a ton of money on a cage that you may not like. I recommend this particularly because of the heating situation. I find that a bin cage is much friendlier to user error than you would think it would be, just because it does have solid sides, so you can get used to what it would take for your hedgehog's cage to remain at an appropriate temperature. And then if you hate the bin, or you know, you want something bigger or something different, you're wasting maybe $10 to $20 rather than spending a multitude of money on a cage that you potentially can't heat or don't like. I personally recommend Christmas tree bins or 50-gallon bins. Those tend to be more readily available than the Christmas tree bins, because Christmas tree bins tend to just be out around Christmas, but 50-gallon bins are available all the time. I have one in my closet right now that Trix was quarantined in. Vivariums, terrariums, and tanks are also options for solid-sided cages, along with like DIY cages. I see people do cage builds. Those are all swell and dandy. So vivariums are incredibly popular outside of the United States. They are fairly difficult to come by here. Not impossible. There are a fair few companies that do make them, predominantly for reptiles. I've found they're a bit different than the European vivariums, but effectively do the same thing. If you can find one and you want to spend the money on one, or if you want to make one, they are great options. Terrariums are also an option in the US. I've seen a lot of people starting to use exoterras, the large ones, and things similar. You obviously just need to make sure that you're getting the correct size. I find that terrariums look really nice. I have one for my leopard gecko, and I am a big fan of just the overall look of it, plus its front openings. It's just, I'm a big fan. After using Critter Nations for as long as I have, I can't imagine using a cage permanently that is not front opening. I can't even imagine it. And then of course there are tanks. Now, I will preface this by saying, I think if you are going to get a tank, you should spend your money elsewhere. However, I do not subscribe to the idea that you can't use tanks for hedgehogs. I just have some stipulations. So, 1, the tank needs to be big enough. 2, it needs to be properly ventilated. The entire top should be, you know, meshed. I've seen some people that have like hooded tanks that are like only partially ventilated. Not a fan. No. The whole reason there is a lot of debate around tanks is people believe that they hold in a lot of moisture. And while I agree that they do retain moisture, I do not believe that they retain more moisture than a bin cage. Feel free to disagree with me. It's just, it's been proven that they don't hold more moisture or humidity than bins by snake owners who have to put on a regular basis animals that need high humidity in bins, such as ball pythons, instead of tanks, because they don't retain enough humidity. I'm just saying. I know some people are gonna disagree. I get it. I totally get it. I think if you're going to not recommend tanks, it should be for other reasons, which are, tanks are very heavy and tanks are very expensive. Unless you already have a very large tank readily available to you and you don't mind how heavy it is, I don't think they're the best option. I really don't. I just don't. I think if you like the look of glass, you're better off with a terrarium. especially one that opens from the front. I'm just saying, that's not a requirement, but I'm just saying they're a better option. You're less likely to have to move them frequently, because a lot of the time with tanks, you have to move them because you have to clean from the top. Anyway, tanks are an option, in my opinion, but I'm not a fan of them. So take that for what you will. Please don't argue about it in my comments. Just do your research. So, moving on. For those who do not have issues with heating, wire cages can be an option. Now, wire cages open up a whole field of things that you can use in the United States, because we have a plethora of wire cages available. You need to make sure of a few things. One, the wire cage needs a deep enough base if you're using bedding. Two, it needs to be large enough, as with all cages. That means you're probably not going to be able to buy something that's like marketed to a hamster. Those cages aren't even good for hamsters. You also might have trouble buying something marketed towards a guinea pig, which is so sad. Basically, you just need to be careful. You need to make sure you know what you're buying, check the dimensions. So many cages look bigger than they are online. So always check the dimensions or buy in person so that you can make sure that it is big enough for the animal you're putting in it. 3, you need to make sure that the bar spacing is appropriate for a hedgehog. I would recommend 1/2 inch. You can get away with 1 inch if you have a fully grown adult hedgehog already. But even 1 inch is wide enough for them to stick their little heads through. And I'm not a fan of using things that they can stick their heads through. So personally, I recommend 1/2 inch bar spacing. I'd also personally recommend avoiding open top wire cages like the Midwest guinea pig habitat. They do sell that with a lid. However, there is another reason I don't totally recommend that one. I know a lot of people like it, but I see in the hedgehog groups people continually running into issues with it, so I'll just throw this out here. It has a fabric or a canvas base. Hedgehogs are incredibly messy. The canvas base is difficult to clean, so just keep that in mind. Also, if you don't buy it with the lid, I have seen many hedgehogs escape. Which brings me to my next point about wire cages. Wire cages can be affordable and easily available, at least here in the United States. However, some hedgehogs climb. If your hedgehog climbs and you have a wire cage, it needs modified. You have to put something up along the bars to make sure that they don't climb. I personally recommend Coroplast because it can be wiped clean. It's plastic, so that you can, you know, wipe it clean. That's what the base of my hedgehog's cage is made out of, and that way it's easily sanitized. I've seen people even use cardboard in a bind when they discovered their hedgehog was randomly climbing one night. It can be incredibly dangerous to allow your hedgehog to continue to climb, so please don't. They have pretty fragile limbs. If they somehow fell and a leg was stuck in one of the bars or something, most likely it would break. It's just not, it's not ideal. I would never recommend a wire cage for a climbing hedgehog. If you're concerned that your hedgehog is going to climb, I would recommend rewinding to some of those solid options, or just being prepared that you will possibly have to. Wire cages can also be DIY'd. A lot of people, including myself, use CNC cages. I don't currently use them. Again, cat, high prey drive. But I used CNC cages for years successfully and loved them. If you go back on my channel, like sort videos from oldest to newest, you will see I went through so many different designs of CNC cages, which was great because I moved a decent amount. I could manipulate the sizing and shaping to what I needed. And they were fairly affordable. I wouldn't call them cheap unless you're getting the supplies fairly cheap. I didn't. You can also buy CNC cages online. I think it's like the guinea pig cages store.com, something like that. But yeah, CNC cages do count as wire cages, even though they're DIY cages. But they use coroplast as a base, so same concept. You have to cover enough of the sides to keep them inside of it. So hopefully some of that information was helpful for you guys. I know I just kind of like word vomited a lot of information, but I wanted to get this video out predominantly because I do get a lot of questions about the cage I use, and I love the cages I use. I have all of my animals in them. I wouldn't if I didn't like them. However, I don't want you guys to think that that's the only option or the best option, because it's not the best option for a lot of people. It can be quite expensive, and so hopefully that was helpful. If you guys have any questions about what may be best for your situation, leave them down in the comments and I will read and reply, and other people can read and reply as well, and it'll be great. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you in my next video, hopefully. Bye!
I'm a lonely, hard feline.
I take what's mine and I leave behind.